In an unexpected whirlwind of consciousness, he sat up. He couldn't perceive whether he was unable to see, or if the space he was in was essentially too saturated with obscurity to take into account him to see. He searched indiscriminately, feeling the sodden rocks that lay underneath him. He additionally saw something rather unconventional, a streaming stream running under his spread-out body. As his eyes changed in accordance with the twirling murkiness around him, he saw that he arose in a little rough stream that was bisecting a huge timberland. Confounded and shocked, he sat up on the dangerous rocks under him, as he tuned into the babbling timberland around him. He heard the stirring of trees in the breeze, and the calls of wild creatures. He saw a dull agony in his skull, and lifted his hand to contact the feeble region, and halted. He understood something awful. His hand, it was foreign to him, he had never seen it. This provoked another horrible acknowledgement. He was unable to recollect that anything about himself. This was a most awful kind of aha second, as rather than the swell of pride that typically goes with such a second, he felt as vacant as though his spirit had left from his body. In a manner it had, the entirety of the recollections, individuals, puts that would typically fill his considerations had left him, and the individual that he was before he had woken up was dead and gone. In the wake of sitting in a confused quiet several minutes, he indeed saw a torment in his mind, however now it was a lot of more awful, a pulsating migraine that would not die down. In the wake of putting a hand on his temple, he understood that he was draining plentifully. What befell me? He thought in a frenzy. He at that point shakily got to his feet with the flimsy certainty of an infant calf. He at that point overviewed the scene around him once more, as his eyes changed in accordance with the abusive haziness, and he saw something that he hadn't previously, something that froze him strong as though he were dunked in fluid nitrogen. He saw a figure. Albeit frozen in height, his internal parts were consuming and agitating with all the savagery of a functioning fountain of liquid magma. How long has that individual been there? He thought tensely, for what reason haven't they said anything to me? I've generally been here. This idea came as a stun, as it was not his own. Maybe it had been radiated straightforwardly into his brain from the figure who was watching him. Despite the fact that he knew nothing of himself or his recollections, he instinctively knew this figure. This at that point incited a totally different tsunami of fear to wash over him, making the trees shake and whirl and the earth to open up underneath him, and gulp down him. He came to once more, however this time he was running. He was charging through the forested areas, branches snapping and getting all over in garments. They were the hands of death attempting to drag him back down to the hidden world, back to that figure. He was unable to hear anything following him, however he could detect it. He could detect the figure's essence on the rear of his neck, similar to frigid hands stroking him. I've generally been here, I generally will be. Another idea shot like a volley of rockets from a maritime boat into his psyche. What does that even mean? He pondered as he kept on dapper frantically through the forested areas. At that point another idea attacked his brain, yet this time it was a memory. Him in a lounge room with two individuals, probably his folks. They were complimenting him. Before them on the oak table was a test with an enormous 97 scribbled in red ink. In the memory, he could feel their pride radiating from them. However, he saw something that felt recognizable in this memory. It was the frigid hands touching the rear of his neck, and despite the fact that he was unable to see the figure, he realized it was there, and it was addressing him by and by. You realize this isn't you, you know reality. He did indeed know reality that the figure was alluding to. He had undermined this test. When the instructor wasn't looking, he had seen Farah's test and replicated her answers. He didn't have the foggiest idea why he did it. He felt as though he was adequately brilliant to have breezed through that assessment. He just did it. Since I made you, since I am the genuine you, and you are me. This confounded him. How is it possible that this would figure be him, when he was indeed himself? Once more, he was running, staggering and meandering aimlessly through the woodland. The frosty hands that were once stroking his neck currently were acquiring an all the more strong hold. Time was dividing. The figure was drawing nearer. Another memory lurked into his skull. He was presently more established and in a new house. He was having a great time, music blasting and individuals moving surrounding him. He looked to one side, and saw individuals that were natural to him. He felt calm, agreeable. He felt as though he could sit on this sofa always, as though he could dissolve into it, and be totally fine being a lounge chair for the remainder of his life. He didn't know whether this was because of the half-completed joint in his grasp, or due to the glow and commonality he felt from his companions around him. However, he was content. He at that point looked to one side, and saw a young lady, obviously dark out-tanked, staggering around, as though her spinal line had been carefully taken out, and an enormous man moved toward her. He was unable to make out what the man said from the start. However, he saw the young lady shakily shake her head to him. The man at that point looks irate and says something again, and she shakes her head once more, with a slight look of dread in her eyes. The man at that point powerfully snatched her by the arm, and began hauling her towards the way to leave. He was going to get up to attempt to help this helpless young lady, yet then he feels a frigid hand on his shoulder. Press him back down into the delicate love seat. Don't, she isn't your anxiety, other than wouldn't have the option to do anything at any rate, you don't owe anybody anything, unwind. He inclined his head back as he saw the young lady being hauled out of the entryway, and he shut his eyes and nodded off. At the point when he indeed continues cognizance, he feels rather bizarre, not because of the consuming fights of his leg muscles, nor the virus gave extremely strong grip encompassing his neck, however it resembled there was a lead weight tied around his midriff. What sort of man, right? He contemplated internally, how could I be so narrow-minded? Directly as he was thinking about this, he heard something similar to the song of a heavenly messenger, the sound of vehicles driving. He turns upward and sees that the sky is starting to ease up, and he figures it should be around 5:30. He could see the zooming headlights somewhere far off, demonstrating the presence of a close-by expressway. He might have cried, he just had 200 or 300 additional feet to go. He thought back for the figure. Interestingly, since he started his break from the forested areas, the figure was to be sure after him, skimming through the woods, no sweat of a hot blade slicing through a square of margarine. With a restored feeling of dread, he beats his way to the side of the interstate. Once there, he starts waving and shouting like a man had. At last a huge truck stops for him and permits him to enter. Subsequent to giving a somewhat whitewashed clarification of the situation that had recently transpired, as he would not like to make his transporter-deliverer think he was unhinged, he sank into the warm cushiony front seat. He noticed that he felt the frigid grasps of the figure, leaving his neck as they drove further constantly away. He could at long last unwind, he was saved. As he peers out the window and sees the figure watching them from the roadside in a somewhat surrendered pose, nonetheless, he had the inclination that he would not be in peril from this shadowy individual anymore. He likewise realized that despite the fact that he was abandoning it, he could never truly be freed of the figure. It was a piece of him, all things considered. It was Satan on each individual's shoulder, one that ought to be disregarded, yet here and there isn't. It takes a resilient individual to oppose enticement, to oppose taking the simple way, the agreeable way, and he was not a tough man.